At 40 below zero, Alaska doesn't test you. It replaces the rules entirely. On December 20th, 1942, a routine test flight over the frozen interior went catastrophically wrong, forcing a young UK Army lieutenant to bail out alone into one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth, with no radio, no food, and winter closing in fast. Her survival would depend on fire, discipline, and an unyielding refusal to give in to the cold, the silence, and the miles ahead. Maggie was 24, a flight engineer by training, and like most young servicewomen of that era, she carried a competence that looked from the outside like calm. Her job was not romance and heroics. It was numbers, systems, tolerances. She monitored gauges, listened to the language of engines, and trusted the disciplined choreography of crew and machine. The mission out of Ladfield near Fairbanks was listed as a cold-weather test flight, routine, almost bureaucratic. The war was consuming Europe and the Pacific. But the work in Alaska had its own urgency. Aircraft were being pushed into conditions that ruined lubricants, warped seals, froze control surfaces, and turned small failures into catastrophes. The crew was 5. They knew the air would be hostile, but they expected hostility in the abstract. Something held back by aluminum skin, heated manifolds, and procedural. The Liberator climbed through brittle air to cruising altitude. At 26,000 feet, the world below flattened into an enormous white map, rivers braided like veins, black spruce rose in clusters, so dense they looked like ink spilled across snow. It was the kind of landscape that deceived pilots because it offered no cues, no towns, no roads, no geometry to suggest scale. The interior could swallow a plane as neatly as it swallowed a person. Then the aircraft began to misbehave. At first it was subtle, the sort of inconsistency that would make a conscientious engineer frown and double-check readings. A control response that lagged half a second longer than it should. A vibration that traveled through the airframe like a rumor. The Liberator wasn't a delicate machine. It was built to absorb punishment. But even a rugged bomber had an anatomy of failure. And once failure began, it could move quickly. The plane rolled, corrected, rolled again. The pilot fought it. Maggie watched instruments and felt the shift from routine to emergency. The moment when procedure stops being a list and becomes a race. The bomber dropped into a flat spin, the most dreaded kind. Not a simple nose-down dive where gravity at least points in a comprehensible direction, but a horizontal rotation. The aircraft revolving like a coin on a table while losing altitude in a widening, sickening spiral. The horizon stopped behaving. A flat spin made a pilot feel as though the world had lost the right to be stable. Airspeed readings became misleading. Controls could go slack. To recover often required altitude they didn't have. The captain, John Sutherland, tried everything. Maggie heard the tone of his voice change. I heard the clipped urgency that meant fear was being held at bay with authority. At 8,000 feet, the calculation became brutal. The plane might be coaxed into a crash landing, but it might also carry them into the ground while still spinning. The captain ordered the crew to prepare to bail out. People romanticize parachutes as a kind of last-minute salvation. They imagine a calm jump, a drifting descent, maybe even a moment of beauty. In truth, stepping out of a failing aircraft is a wager made under pressure, and it is not made in comfort. When Maggie moved toward the escape hatch, the air that pushed through the opening struck her like a solid force. The cold at altitude was not simply low temperature. It was predatory, instantly invasive. It burned her lungs. It snatched away moisture. It turned eyelashes into needles. Maggie strapped on her chute, performed the movements she'd practiced, and reached the point where hesitation would be fatal. The others chose to remain with the aircraft, believing Sutherland might still wrestle it down. It was not cowardice or bravery on either side. It was competing assessments made in seconds. Maggie took a breath that felt inadequate, as if the cold had stolen half the oxygen from the air. Then she jumped into emptiness and let gravity claim her. For a few seconds, there was only falling, a loud rush of air, and the animal knowledge that nothing separated her from the ground except silken faith in a mechanism. When the parachute finally snapped open, it did so with violence, yanking her body upright, jerking straps into her shoulders, stealing another breath. The shock was clarifying. She was alive. She looked up once, an instinctive glance that meant nothing but comfort, and then down. Because down was everything. Below her stretched an unbroken wilderness. The snow covered the country like a shroud. Spruce forests formed dark islands. A frozen river cut through the landscape, pale and wide. There were no roads, no buildings, no smoke, no human mark. It was the kind of view that looked clean from the air and murderous on the ground. The B-24 drifted away in the distance, carrying 4 men and every piece of equipment that would have made Maggie's situation survivable in a conventional sense. The plane vanished into the white, the sound of engines faded, and with it, the last sign of company. Her landing was not graceful. She came down hard into deep snow, the impact driving air from her lungs and bearing her to the waist. For a moment, she couldn't move. The cold rose immediately through her boots and legs like water. When she finally forced herself upright, she stood in silence, so complete it felt staged. The only sound was the faint movement of parachute fabric in the wind. It was already afternoon in late December. Daylight in Alaska is stingy. The sun makes a low arc, never gaining the warmth of height. The winter solstice had just passed. She had hours, maybe fewer, before darkness would drop and the temperature would fall even further. The Arctic did not offer a gentle night. It delivered a long, hard one. Maggie took stock of what she had and what she did, unto it the practiced clarity of someone trained to inventory resources in crises. She had a small Boy Scout knife. She had a box of waterproof matches. She had the clothes on her body, uniform, boots, gloves, and she had the parachute, a tangle of silk and nylon and cord. She had no food, no compass, no haju, no signal flares, no sleeping bag. She had no certainty of direction. The nearest settlement was not near in any human sense. It was an idea. Many people would have died that first night without making a single heroic mistake. Exposure kills quietly. It begins with shivering, then numbness, then the kind of fatigue that feels like relief. The temptation is to sit down, to stop fighting the cold and let the body do what it wants. Maggie understood enough about hypothermia to fear that temptation. She also understood that a person alone in that environment didn't get to be sentimental about discomfort. She needed shelter immediately, not tomorrow, not after she rested, not after she figured out a plan. Shelter was the plan. She gathered the parachute and wrapped it around herself, turning silk into insulation. It was thin and inadequate compared to proper gear, but it trapped air and reduced heat loss. She burrowed into the snow using drift and depression as protection from wind. The fabric made a crude cocoon. The snow itself helped. Snow insulates when you're inside it, not when you're on top of it. She lay there as the sky darkened, listening to the interior grow colder. In the distance, wolves howled, not close enough to be immediate danger, but near enough to remind her that she was not the only creature hungry in this place. Sleep came in fragments. Her body shook with violent shivers as spent calories like gasoline. She woke repeatedly, disoriented, unsure for a moment where she was, then remembering with a surge of dread. Breath iced her eyelashes. The fabric stiffened as moisture froze. She fought the urge to lie still too long. By morning, her extremities were already threatened. Fingers felt clumsy, toes were numb, as if her feet belonged to someone else. Frostbite doesn't arrive like a dramatic injury. It creeps in, a quiet theft. Maggie knew she needed fire, not for comfort, but for circulation, for survival, for the ability to use her hands. The matches in her pocket suddenly carried the weight of life itself. In that country, fire is not merely warmth. Fire is permission. The first match died in wind the moment she struck it. The second flared and vanished. The third did the same. 3 small failures, but each one felt larger because it cost her what she couldn't replace. Panic began to press at the edges of her mind. Not screaming panic, but a tightening, a sense of time closing in. If she wasted the matchas, she would be reduced to primitive friction methods in sub-zero cold with numb hands, a nearly impossible task. The world would not give her another try. On the 4th attempt, she forced herself to slow down. She looked for shelter from wind. She dug beneath a fallen spruce where branches had created a pocket of relative dryness. She scraped bark, shaved wood into thin curls, built a small nest of tinder. She used her body as a windbreak, crouched low, and struck the match with deliberate care. This time the flame caught the fine shavings and clung there, trembling, then strengthening, as she fed it. When the fire finally stabilized into something more than a fragile flicker, Maggie felt the surge of relief so intense it was nearly dizzying. Heat returned to her fingers with pain, a stabbing sensation that meant blood was moving again. She held her hands near the flames and made a quiet decision that mattered more than any plan. She would not die there. If you enjoyed Maggie's survival story and want to see more inspiring and extreme survival tips, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon.